Hey folks, welcome to the channel. Today's build is going to be a basketweave Damascus fighter made from 1084 and 15N20 steel and some carbon fiber for the handle. Here is what it's going to look like, except it's going to be a takedown. Let's get started. I've alternated the 1084 and 15N20 into a stack, and now it's time to get it in the forge. So we start by forge welding this together. This is actually a pretty basic forge weld. There's nothing really complicated about forging this piece. The graphic in the corner shows the billet that we started with. Now that the layers are forge welded together, we can draw this out into a long square bar. The forging process introduces a little bit of distortion, so our bar at the end is going to look something like this. The pattern we're trying to achieve is a basket weave. After we get this in a long square bar, we're going to cut it up into 4, rotate the pieces, and realign them like this. We've almost got this to the thickness we need. A couple more heats just to get it nice and even, and then we'll take it to the long flat dies just to make sure it's nice and level and flat. So we got the billet all forged out. It's a 1 inch by 1 inch square by about 16 inches long. Cut in half. Cut in half again. Okay, so I've cut them up into 4. I've ground and etched the edges, and I've taken each one and turned it 90 degrees, put them all back together. So now we're going to grind the sides, the insides, and forge weld them back together. Now that we've got these 4 pieces forge welded back together, we're going to draw it out into a long square bar again. We want to make this pattern a little finer, so we're going to replicate that again and get this. Remember folks, the graphics you're seeing is what the end of the billet looks like. We're going to have to get that on the top of the billet. So later on, we're going to have to tile it. So now we've just repeated that whole process that we did, cut it up into 4, restack it, re-weld it, back in the forge. When I'm doing a 4-way, I do like to use the squaring dies just to set the first forge weld, because that applies pressure in 2 different angles, actually 4 different angles at the same time. Then I'll move on to the flat dies. So by the end of this forging session, we want the billet set up so it's in the proper orientation for tiling. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, so here we are after forge welding the second four-way together. You'll notice that the billet is not square anymore. It's wider on one side than it is on the other. That's because we got to tile it. So there's a little test etch. This is the end piece, so the layers aren't quite as straight here just because it's an end. I'm sure in the middle it's going to be a little better. So we've got our billet all sliced up here. Now we're simply just going to restack it like this, keeping the numbers all aligned here. We got 8 full slices excluding the end pieces, so that's really good. Now I just need to grind all the mating sides. Here we go for our final forge welding session. We want to reduce this by at least about a half. So let's see where we're at now. I've ground off the edges and the mild steel. Let's take a closer look here. So here you can see our pattern, which looks really cool. Now that I've got all the mild steel removed, we're forging it to the thickness we need for a knife. I also want to mention on this build, we're not going to be forging the knife to shape. We're going to be cutting it out of a billet because we don't want to distort this beautiful pattern we just created. Well folks, here is the final billet. It came out at 14 inches. It's 3/16 thick. And I just love the pattern here. I'll see if I can get a closer look here for you guys to check it out. You can see there's just a little bit of distortion in each square. I think it kind of adds to the pattern a little bit. Now we're going to lay out our knife pattern on the billet and cut it out. And note, we put the tang where that flipped tile was, so it won't matter. Now I'm smoothing out the profile on the grinder, and then we're going to move to doing the false edge. And now I'll grind 80% of the bevel before we do the heat treat. The pre-heat treat bevel is all ground. Now let's do some normalization thermal cycles and get it into heat treat. It's time to turn this piece of steel into a knife, and that means heat treating. Here I'm dipping it into Parks 50 quench oil to harden the steel. So I've ground the flats on the surface grinder. Now we're going to take it to the HRC tester and see where we're at. We're right at 59. Let's give it one more shot. 59. Now it's time to do the final grinding of this knife. Now that I'm done the bevel, I'm moving over to the mill and squaring up the shoulders. So here it is after milling the shoulder. It's got a nice flat area. I have a flat spot here and here for the guard to fit. I'm just doing a little sanding on the ricasso area just so I don't do this later and change the fit on the guard. I have a piece of mild steel for the guard, and now I'm just drilling and milling the slot. So I created a template for the guard and kind of drew it out on top of my guard here. Now we're just going to grind to it. The reason I want to get close is because we're going to be putting pins in, line-up pins, and I want to make sure that the pins are not going to be off the side or there's going to be scallops in here, so I want to make sure they don't interfere anywhere. So there's the guard and the spacer with the lineup pins all nice and solid in there. Now we got to start on the handle, but before we do that, I need to fix the tang here. You notice the tang is very straight, and I need it to curve. So next we're going to put just the awl thread in here because of course we need the pommel nut to screw into that. So I've just got some 1/4 awl thread, and I've had comments before. There's absolutely nothing wrong with welding a piece of awl thread in here. You just need to make sure you normalize this area after you weld it. So I've got the awl thread welded on, I've normalized this whole thing, I kind of smoothed out the edges. Now we can think about the handle. So we're going to be using this carbon fiber, and I have these in little sheets, and this one is almost the thickness of my tang, so I'm going to kind of do a frame here, and then I'll be able to just stack this and glue all these, epoxy all these together. So while the handle's gluing up, let's focus back on the fitting. So we have the guard and the spacer. Now let's talk about the pommel and the pommel nut. Here I'm drilling a hole in the pommel for the pommel nut, and this will secure the pommel to the tang. And now it's time to make the pommel nut on the lathe. First we're going to drill and tap to match the threads that we have on the tang. Now I'm making a little decorative end on the end of the pommel nut. Okay, so we got our handle all done. Let's fit it up and see what it looks like. Okay, so it's snug, doesn't move around, which is great. Now it fits nicely in there. I also drilled a little hole this way through it so we could take an 1/8 inch drill bit and tighten it down. Now I'm drilling the holes for the lineup pins so that things don't move. Now that we got everything put together and perfectly fit, no gaps, we're going to take it all apart, start from the top. Now we're going to finish all the sculpting on the guard. Okay folks, now I want to put some scallops okay, on this guard. They'll basically be scallops like this. So I've put some layout fluid and I've drawn a marker here and here. So that's where I want that scallop to be removed from. And on to the spacer. The spacer, the pommel, and the pommel nut are going to get some gold inlay. To do inlay, I start by engraving a channel. After I have the channel engraved all the way around, I'll go back and add dovetails, and that'll make sure the gold doesn't come out. And this is the fun part, pushing 24 karat gold wire into the channel. Now that the inlay is all done, we just got to sand it and make it look pretty. So here we are, finished with the gold inlay. It's come out really nice. Sanded to just past 220. I still have to do the relief on this one right here, and then of course bevel this guy. After this, I'm going to sand and buff all the fittings, and then they're going to go into hot salt to turn them jet black. So we got the salts at about 285 degrees, just a little over. We got a nice rolling boil. I got my parts sitting in the cleaning solution. Now it's time to get them in the salts. They'll stay in here for 15 to 20 minutes. Now it's time to shape the handle to make this much more comfortable to hold. Now I'm putting my maker's mark on the blade, and then I just need to etch it. Are you guys ready to see the completed knife?